All right, thanks a lot, Diana. So I'm gonna talk about some research that we've recently done on estimating soil moisture and runoff from ground-mounted solar photovoltaic sites. And this was funded by the Department of Energy. My co-author is Jake Galsky, who's a researcher 5 working in my lab. And so we'll start off by just kind of identifying the scope of the solar issue in the United States. So there's a tremendous interest in developing ground-mounted solar facilities. And this would be to provide renewable energy. There were over 462 gigawatts in the internet connection queue at the start of 2021. And that was 10 times the amount of built ground-mounted solar, which is only 47 gigawatts at that time. And so if all of these projects were developed, that would be about 3.7 million acres of land that would need to be converted into ground-mounted solar. And since generally most of these are in rural areas, there's concerns over stormwater runoff and over loss of productive lands. So most of the issues here have to do with permitting. And you have local, state, and federal authorities having jurisdiction, or AHJs. And a surprising number of governments treat ground-mounted photovoltaic facilities as if they're completely impervious. So it's just like you're building a parking lot. And this isn't realistic because, as you know, there's gaps between the arrays and there's bare ground or there's vegetated ground. So you actually can get a fair amount of infiltration and that reduces the amount of runoff. So the current state of the art really leads to an inaccurate overestimate of the runoff that would happen from solar facilities. And in order to mitigate that runoff, the engineering firms and the solar developers are required to put in stormwater detention ponds. And these can cost tens of thousands to even millions of dollars, depending on how large the site is. So it's a big issue. So the DOE was interested in funding this research in order to study the hydrology at stormwater, at ground-mounted solar photovoltaic sites, in order to estimate stormwater runoff and estimate how much they actually generate. And the factors that we studied were soil and topographic characteristics, surface cover, disconnected impervious surfaces, which means you have spacing between the panels, and then the climatic factors. We established research sites at 5 locations across the US. And we had one in Minnesota, one in Oregon, one in New York, one in Georgia, and one in Colorado. And all of these sites had perennial vegetation, so they were fairly innovative. New York had tall grass and clover, and part of the site was grazed with sheep. It was a relatively wet climatic area on a fairly shallow, fine textured soil. Georgia was a sandy clay with cover crops and diverse pollinator mix. It also had pretty high rainfall. And you can see that here. Some of it is mowed, some of it is not. Minnesota had these beautiful pollinator habitat features. And it's a very sandy soil with a moderate rainfall amount. Oregon and Colorado were our two arid sites. They have about 16 inches of annual rainfall. And they're both clay soils. They have pollinator vegetation, but because it's so dry, pollinator vegetation kind of goes through an annual cycle where it dies off in the summertime. So at each of these sites, we measured the rainfall under the open sky. We measured the rainfall under the drip edge. We installed soil moisture monitoring probes beneath the arrays, beneath the drip edge, and then in the area between the arrays. We used a TDR probe, time domain reflectometry, to measure soil moisture. And then we had an infiltrometer, which was a sprinkler infiltrometer. And we used this to measure runoff, as well as saturated hydraulic conductivity. So then we took the data from these 5 sites and used it to calibrate and validate a 3-dimensional model called Hydrus 3D. Hydrus 3D simulates 2- and 3-dimensional water flow. And as you can imagine, when you have these arrays that have, length and width and all kinds of different dimensions, you need that kind of information, especially to deal with the runoff at the drip edge, because that provides an additional input to the soil that would not be handled in a 1-dimensional model. So basically, in the 2-dimensional way we set this up, we had a cross section going up and down the slope for our model. And I'll show a diagram of that later on. And so we have 3 different upper boundary conditions. So right beneath the arrays, we have a no flux boundary, no rainfall, because those are impervious. At the drip edge, we actually allow the runoff from the panel to hit the soil. And then the third area is between the arrays in the full sun area. And there you have just ambient rainfall. So those are 3 different upper boundary conditions. Then, as far as the modeling is concerned, we had inputs like soil depth, soil texture, soil bulk density, saturated moisture content, hydraulic conductivity, and slope. And then the data that we were measuring, in other words, precip, drip edge runoff, and the soil moisture were used to either as inputs or to evaluate the accuracy of the Hydrus model. And in Hydrus, there is a sort of water balance that's represented, and that water balance includes empirical models for the soil hydraulic conductivity. So as the soil wets and dries, the hydraulic conductivity of the soil, it increases and decreases. So we have a hydraulic conductivity curve that is really driven by soil moisture. And when the soil is wet, you get higher infiltration rates. When the soil is dry, the saturated hydraulic conductivity no longer applies because the soil is unsaturated. And at that point, you have to use the unsaturated hydraulic conductivity, which is calculated based on the soil moisture. The parameters of those curves are two parameters called alpha and N. N is related to the soil texture, and alpha is related to the size of the largest pores in the soil. Okay, so basically then we have our measured soil moisture over time. That's the green curve that's shown here for one of our sites. We have our input precipitation, which are the blue vertical lines. On the right-hand side, you see the x-axis, the y-axis. And then we have our modeled moisture content, which is the brownish color. And the moisture content is shown on the y-axis on the left side. So how does that look in terms of agreement? Does it look relatively good? It's not bad when you're doing this kind of work over long periods of time. What we do to measure the accuracy is we use the root mean square error. And so we had root mean square error terms at our 5 sites that were in a range of about 0.02 to about 0.04. So relative to what we're measuring, which is in the magnitude of like 0.3, these are relatively small errors. Just, kind of for your elucidation here, here's the different soil textures, the different 48-hour precipitation events for large storms that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then this is the amount of concentration of runoff that occurs at the drip edge. So if we get a rainstorm of 1 centimeter, 5 centimeters would drip off for the first site. 10.6 centimeters would drip off at the Minnesota site. And so it varies depending on the site. Some of these sites are what we call fixed arrays, which means they always face south, and you get more drip edge runoff from those sites than you do from tracking arrays, which track the sun going from facing east in the morning to facing west in the evening. So you can get some periods of the day when it's actually horizontal, and then you get, distribution of rain on both sides. So that ends up kind of for the tracking arrays, which are Colorado, Georgia, and New York. Colorado, Georgia, and Oregon. That tends to decrease the amount. And then you also have an effect of the wind and the wind direction. So in New York, it seemed like the wind was always coming from one side or the other, rather from the north or the south. So that tended to decrease the drip edge runoff, whereas in Minnesota, the wind tended to come from the north a lot of times, or from the south. And so we got a higher sort of concentration and runoff at the drip edge. All right, so here's a diagram kind of showing what we're dealing with. We have the precipitation hitting the arrays, which are impervious, and the runoff goes to the edge and drips off. We also have runoff coming from upslope, infiltrating underneath the arrays. We have infiltration under the drip edge. Then we have the full sun area, and you can have precipitation hitting that area as well. That's where a lot of the vegetation is its most dense. We tend to get the highest amount of evapotranspiration there, and so we get quite a bit of infiltration. So our model has to account for all of this complexity. And here's a screenshot from our modeling showing the various pathways for water, as well as the evolution over time of the soil moisture content. So the redder colors are basically wetter soils, and the blue colors are drier soils. And anywhere you have a redder color means the soil is more likely to have runoff if you get additional rain. So there's this theory in hydrology called the Hortonian theory of runoff. And so basically it says if the soil is saturated and it gets rainfall in excess of the saturated hydraulic conductivity, then you will generate runoff. So anything in excess of the saturated hydraulic conductivity will run off. Obviously, if you have unsaturated soil, you still have pores which are available to sorb water, to infiltrate water. And so you can have infiltration and very little runoff until those areas become saturated. So ultimately what our model does is we take 3 of these arrays, we assume that's our representative like elementary volume, and then we estimate the runoff coming out the bottom. So based on our study of these 5 sites, we found that the model was able to estimate the soil moisture relatively accurately, and as well, we assume that for the large storms, which are very of short duration, 1 or 2 days, we assume that our model is working relatively well in terms of estimating runoff. And what we found is that the factors that really affected the runoff were things like the design storm. So we implemented 24-hour design storms of different return frequencies, ranging from 2 years to 10 years to 25 years to 100 years. As you get to larger return frequencies, the storm intensity and depth gets larger and larger. So as you go from a 2-year design storm to a 100-year design storm at New York and Oregon, the runoff goes up by about 1.5 times. If you look at what happens with compacted soil versus low built density soils, runoff goes up by about 100%. If you look at soil depths as you go from a shallow soil to a deep soil, or actually from a deep soil to a shallow soil, runoff decreases by about 78%. And then if you have row crops versus mature prairie, your runoff increases by about 38%. And then we could also run the model with and without the arrays once we had it calibrated. And we found that adding arrays increased runoff by about 14% relative to a situation where there were no arrays. Changing the panel spacing also had an effect. So if you decrease the panel spacing from 35 to 15 feet, the runoff increases by 14%. So as you go from the top to the bottom, there's a decreasing influence of the factors here. And then there's another method that's often used to estimate runoff at solar facilities. This is called the Natural Resources Conservation Service runoff curve number. And that's based on the soil texture and the vegetation. And so we applied that method to all of our sites and found that the NRCS runoff curve number generated about 38% more runoff for our sites than the Hydrus modeling. So that's a pretty big difference. So we're doing two things to kind of advance science here. First, we're assuming, that most authorities having jurisdiction are treating these sites as if they're totally impervious. In other words, every drop of rain that falls on the site is going to run off. So the comparisons we're doing here don't even go that far. We're not comparing our model results to what would happen if it's an impervious site. Okay, so these reductions that you're seeing here are relative to an NRCS method that assumes the site is totally pervious. The NRCS doesn't know there's a solar panel here or there, so it's just based on soil and land cover. All right, so even the NRCS method is overestimating the runoff by 38%. Imagine how much the conventional methods are overestimating runoff. It's a big problem. All right, so once we did this, we realized, hey, there are lots of people who would dearly love to have a tool like this, but the average user doesn't know how to run Hydrus or how to get the data to run it. So what we did instead was we ran Hydrus for a large range of conditions, and those are shown here in the green. Soil texture, soil depth, bulk density, vegetation, presence or absence of panels, width of the panels, spacing of the panels, or orientation up and down the slope or along the contours, percent slope. And we just ran thousands of simulations with all these combinations. And then we developed nomograms to represent the results of the modeling so that all a user has to do is enter the information here into the simple Excel spreadsheet, and then they get an estimate of the runoff curve number, and they can enter a design storm depth. So here in this case, it's a 10-inch storm that would be like 100-year return frequency. And the model will tell how much runoff is expected. So out of a 10-inch storm, this particular case would give you 7.7 inches of runoff. All right, so let's go through how we did that. So the runoff estimates were assumed, first of all, based on arrays that were installed in parallel rows. All right, and then we ran a few simulations with arrays up and down the slope to get at like what's the percent difference between that and the simulations where we ran parallel arrays. So we ran most of our simulations with parallel arrays and then just did an adjustment for the up and down slope orientation. We routed the runoff off the panels and allowed infiltration beneath the drip edge in the full sun area and beneath the panels. Any runoff would continue down slope where it could be infiltrated under the next set of arrays. We simulated panels at a full tilt down slope to simulate kind of high precipitation interception, which would be a worst case scenario. We assume that the soils are uniform and initially at field capacity. So it's like aniseed moisture content 2. Soil is assumed to be free from snow and frost, so this doesn't work in the winter. We assume the vegetation is uniform everywhere. So we didn't look at differences under the arrays versus between arrays. So that's probably something that could be improved on. Our bottom boundary condition is no flux. So again, we assume there's an impermeable layer at the bottom of the soil profile, which again is a worst case scenario and increases the risk of surface runoff. So we're doing all of this to get a worst case scenario. All right, and even when we do that, it's still better than the NRCS runoff curve number method, or assuming the whole site is impervious. So let me run through a few examples here. So our idea is that you can use this tool in two ways. One is to select sites that are being evaluated for their suitability to build ground mounted solar. So you can evaluate the sites without arrays, and then with pre-construction vegetation to evaluate the baseline runoff with existing soil texture, depth, and things of that nature. So for example, a loam soil with a shallow depth, a moderate bulk density, row crops, no solar panels. We get a runoff curve number of 88, which generates about 8.5 inches of runoff. Then you can go to a post-construction characteristic evaluation. So for example, you add in solar panels, leaving the soil depth the same, assuming maybe you had some pollinator habitat, which is good for the soil, and lowered the bulk density. Everything else is pretty much the same. And what you can see here is that, you know, the installation of arrays was kind of canceled out by the pollinator habitat. And there's really not a lot of change between the pre-construction and the post-construction situation. So this shows that you can mitigate the effect of installing the arrays by having this pollinator vegetation. So next we get into like, how do you deal with changes in bulk density? And it turns out that bulk density is a very important factor here. So what we did was, again, we used our nomograms. We ran a whole series of simulations with different bulk densities on different soil textures with different soil depths. And so these are what the nomograms look like in terms of runoff curve numbers. You can see that the loamy sand always has less runoff than the finer textured soils. All right, and that the higher bulk density has more runoff than the lower bulk density. So any management practice that can be done which would help to reduce the bulk density would have the effect of increasing infiltration. So do you know what those practices might be? Any ideas? How would you decrease bulk density?
I'm just guessing, but you just talked about like planting pollinator crop.
Yeah.
Was that having it, but that was impacting something different than bulk density?
No, you're right. Yeah, planting pollinators has deep roots. And so you also encourage, you know, soil fauna like earthworms, and so you have a reduction in bulk density when you plant any perennial vegetation. What else might you think?
Okay, you.
No, I don't see an okay on my screen here.
I don't either. Keep going. I'm trying to figure out.
All right.
Okay.
Is that a touch screen?
No. Nope.
Huh.
Okay.
All right. Well, anyway,
I do volume mode. I'm touching something, but yeah. Do you see? Okay. Oh.
all right,
Okay.
we got that one solved. All right, so that's a good suggestion. Any other suggestions about how do you reduce bulk density? I can't see any chat, so I don't know if anybody's putting stuff in the chat.
I see the chat and I don't see, they have no suggestions in Duluth for reducing
All
our
right.
soil block density.
What if you like mix some sand in there?
You could, but that's
Like-
expensive.
Like just blade it, like.
Yeah, okay,
You could blade it or like do something mechanical
yes,
to break it up.
that would be the best way to do it, is some kind of tillage. And there's one other that's really important, and that's during construction, avoid driving heavy equipment on wet soils. Because you'll compact the soils with the heavy equipment on wet soils. So during construction, that's another practice. All right, so going forward, let me just give you a few illustrations of the effect of soil texture. You can choose different textures from the drop-down list. So here we'll look at loam versus sand, so going from finer to coarser texture. And you can get information about a site from the Natural Resources Conservation Service Surgo database. Or you can sample the soils and analyze them for soil texture. So generally you get more runoff on finer soils than you do on coarser soils. And so here, all we're changing is the soil texture. And we're going from a runoff curve number of 80, which generates about 7.5 inches of runoff, to 55, which generates about 4.5 or 4.25 inches. And that's a really large reduction. You're reducing over 3 inches of runoff, which is huge. That will translate into big savings in terms of the number of sediment detention ponds that would have to be built on a loamy site versus a sandy site. So this first thing we're telling engineering firms is don't build these things on fine textured soils, okay? You're gonna have a lot of cost. Next, the effect of bulk density. Normally you use whatever the soil's bulk density was before construction. Here's some guidelines for bulk density values in grams per cubic centimeter. Typical is 1.4. An uncompacted soil would be 1 to 1.2. A compacted soil would be 1.6 to 1.8. Now, you could run your model with, pre-construction, and then you could go to post-construction. So for example, if your pre-construction was 1.2 for your bulk density and you had poor management of your site and you drove heavy equipment on a wet soil, you would compact the soil to about 1.6. Well, that would take your runoff curve number from 72 to 89.9, and your runoff from about 6.5 to about 8 3/4. So again, that's a huge difference. Next, we look at soil depth, and so rooting zone depth is the area where the soil profile is really suited for infiltrating water. And we're assuming there's a restrictive layer below that, either bedrock, a fragipan, an impermeable layer, or a shallow water table. And you can get rooting zone depths from, again, the Surgo database. If you don't have soil borings. Generally speaking, your runoff increases as you get shallower soils. So going from a 3-foot deep soil to a 1-foot deep soil, your curve number goes from about 69 to 91. Your runoff goes from about 6 to about 9. So again, it's a big difference. Next effect is vegetation. And here are all the different kinds of vegetation types that are included. The way we got to this in our model was obviously we ran most of our simulations here with pollinator habitat or mature prairie. And then we looked at the percent differences between those kinds of vegetative covers and these other vegetative covers in the typical NRCS tables for effect of vegetation. We just created a correction factor. So if you're exploring vegetation, the only thing to keep in mind is that you would only change the type of vegetative cover in the menus, not the bulk density. The model internally accounts for the effect of different vegetative types on bulk density based on a literature review that we did. So the only time you change bulk density when you're doing scenarios is when you're trying to consider the effect of tillage or heavy equipment or things like that, not vegetation. So here we're comparing pollinator to turf grass. And the curve numbers are relatively similar, but the pollinator is a little bit better. So you don't have a big difference here, maybe a ½ inch. But if we had run bare soil or gravel, there would be a large difference. You would have a runoff curve number that would be a lot larger. Next, we looked at slope steepness, and again, we did run scenarios for this in our hydrous modeling. We found this was one of the parameters that really didn't have a big effect. So for example, going from a site that has a slope of about 5% to one that has 10% changes the curve number by only about 2. And that's pretty minimal. Looking at the effect of the arrays, so here we're looking at a baseline situation where there are no arrays relative to the situation where you have the arrays at, a 10-foot width and a 25-foot spacing following the contours. You do get a good increase in the runoff curve number and an increase in the amount of runoff. The effect of spacing is also something that has an impact, but not quite as large as the presence or absence. So here, going from a 25 to a 15-foot spacing, you get a small change in runoff. Array orientation has a much bigger effect. So if the arrays are oriented up and down the slopes, then you have drip edges that have concentrated runoff, which is going up and down the slopes. And then you have rainfall in between the arrays, which is generating runoff up and down the slopes, and there's no arrays whatsoever in that section. And so there's lots of room for infiltration. And most of the runoff is from the concentrated flow at the drip edges. And so here, big difference between arrays oriented along the contours where your runoff curve number is about 80 versus arrays that are oriented up and down the slope where you get a runoff curve number of about 95. So that's another maybe 2 inches of runoff or so. And then the last factor is the effect of the design storm. You can look up, the design storm in inches of rain for any 24-hour storm in the NOAA Atlas 14 precipitation frequency tables. And then you can put that into the input box here. And you can look at the effect that has on the amount of runoff generated. So going from a 100-year storm down to a 2-year storm, you have a big difference in the amount of runoff, going from about 7.5 to nearly none. So bigger storms generate more runoff, as you might expect. Okay, so we made this calculator available near the beginning of this year. We've already had about 150 downloads. And it's really taken off. We were really surprised by how many people were interested in this. The largest group of people are people working in engineering firms who are building solar facilities. So we've had 50 engineering firms all across the world, actually. We don't show it on the map, but there's a number of different foreign entities as well. We also have a large interest from the solar industry. And then we have users in academia, government, and other people who are just like, I don't know, interested in this, and who knows why. And you can see where we're attracting the most interest. Virginia and Colorado have the greatest amount of interest. Virginia, because this is an area where a huge number of solar farms are being installed. And they have some really, really challenging topography and soils. Colorado, a nice area for renewable energy, lots of interest there. Then you have the states of Minnesota, New York, Texas, and California. And then a whole range of other states. So to conclude here, we did develop this user-friendly calculator that has a wide range of inputs. And as fast as you can enter the data, it will generate changes to the curve number. It's really fast. You don't have to wait around. You can get estimates for pre and post construction scenarios. You can enter a design storm and estimate actual depth of runoff. In playing with this, we can generate runoff curve numbers that are 100 for certain combinations of factors, which would mean all of the rainfall at the site would run off. But at the same time, we can also generate no runoff. If, for instance, we have a deep sandy soil with pollinator vegetation and arrays oriented parallel to the contour. So everything in between is possible. Now, a lot of users in engineering firms are used to using hydrologic models for this kind of modeling. They use TR55, SWIM, or HydroCAD. And what we're suggesting for these users is to run our model for different sections of their site. So a sandy part or a clay site or a area where they do some excavation and they expose subsoils, or an area where they might have a high water table, and then get the runoff curve number for those different areas and then use those in your TR55, SWIM, or HydroCAD to represent the spatial variability and potential runoff. We think this is a big scientific advance, and so there's a lot of interest in this whole topic. And if you're interested, you can go to the website listed here and you can actually download it for yourself. We have a lot of information about what we've done, and put my email here if you're interested in finding out more. So thanks. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks.
And I do see a chat online about, do we plan to develop a web interface? We have talked about doing that sort of as a commercial spin-off. And it's something we're actively pursuing right now because there's so much interest in this. We just think that it would probably be a good idea to sort of get into the commercialization of this tool. I don't know. What do you guys think about it?
That's really cool. Yeah.
I'm still stuck on, they think that the site is 100% impervious.
Yeah. The state of Virginia is one area where that actually applies. And the reason they did that was because engineering firms were coming in and saying, oh, we will mitigate all the runoff from the sites, you know, because we have the right approach for doing that and we know what we're doing. And they did all the modeling to sort of show that, yeah, you don't have to worry. But what they ended up doing was messing sites up because Virginia has a lot of soils that formed in marshy environments. And so there's a lot of pyrite, which is iron sulfide. And that iron pyrite is buried in the soil and it's in the reduced state. When the solar developers go in and they excavate or grade the sites to install solar panels, the subsoils are exposed to oxygen. And the iron sulfide oxidizes. It creates hydrogen sulfide, which is an acid. And the pH of the soil can go down to 1 or 2. And when you get those kind of acidic conditions, no vegetation will grow. And, you know, the subsoils are probably impervious as well. So what was ending up happening was there were huge amounts of runoff. And so Virginia just said, okay, this is nonsense. You guys are gonna have to assume these sites are impervious. That's what happened.
South Carolina and Georgia are moving away right now.
Are they? Yeah, we're seeing this kind of in other places as well. Minnesota is not going that way. Minnesota is an example of a state where we have some good tools that have been around for a while through the NPCA. And so we do allow people to consider the disconnected impervious nature of these sites.
Brent has his hand up.
Okay, Brent.
Delzo is in there, and there's another chat question, but Brent raised his hand, so.
I'd like to be good. Yeah, so David, you mentioned, advising engineers or engineering firms to avoid fine textured soils for projects like this. And I can see why that makes sense. We've kind of been thinking a little bit about these installations from another perspective, which is that, there might be some sites out in the agricultural landscape where because they're fine textured soils, they're already poorly performing from a crop yield standpoint, and that they might be good candidates for something else like an agrivoltaic system. I was wondering if you could just comment on that a little bit.
Sure, yeah, Brent, that's a great question, and we're aware that, solar facilities are still going to be constructed on finer textured soils. And so with our runoff calculator, the engineering firms can explore ways of managing and designing those fine textured sites to reduce runoff. And that can be done through an array of different practices, such as, bulk density management, array spacing, planting pollinator habitat. And it is possible to reduce runoff to very low values through a combination of those practices, with the one caveat that the soil depth should be relatively good. You're really cooked if you have a fine textured shallow soil. There's not a lot you can do.
Does that include shallow in the sense that there's a locally high water table?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Amy has a question in the chat. If you have any plans to submit papers to peer-reviewed journals.
Yes, thank you, Amy. We have 2 papers, one of which is under review, and that's on the calibration and validation of the model at the 5 experimental sites. And then we have another article which is 90% completed, which describes our runoff calculator tool. So we anticipate that one will be submitted for review sometime in the next month. We're really excited about getting both of those published. We do also, at this website here on info and publications, we do have, and at our calculator download, we have a user manual. So you can actually read about, you know, all the things that I've talked about today.
Jay, do you have questions up there?
Yeah, I just dropped one in the chat.
Oh, okay.
All right, do different vegetative communities grow in shade, open / drip edge? I think that would be a really good thing to explore. Right now, it's a hard lift just to get engineering firms to try and plant pollinator habitat, because it takes a while to get established. There's some maintenance that's needed. And they much prefer just putting gravel on the site or just planting turf grass. But we
Just
are
because
seeing,
it's easier, cheaper, or
it's really kind of a O&M issue.
There's some safety issues with pollinator habitat throughout the site too. So if there's any maintenance that has to go out there, waist-high grass is a lot more dangerous for whatever's there working with electricity than lower grass too.
Yeah, that's why I say it's mostly O&M issues. Operations and maintenance. But we are seeing a number of engineering firms and solar firms wanting to sort of overcome local resistance against establishing solar farms. And one of the ways they can do that is by saying that they're doing regenerative health practices, or they're, they're planting pollinator habitat, and there's aesthetic value to what they're doing. So, and some solar firms are exploring the idea of getting carbon credits. So we're seeing a whole lot of activity in different sort of ways that are pushing the needle farther and farther towards these more innovative vegetative management systems. And that includes the whole broad area of agrivoltaics, which could include things like grazing sheep or raising bees. So there's a whole range of activities in this particular space. Yeah. And then maybe the next level to get to your question directly is that, particularly in arid areas where soil moisture is so critical, it might make a lot of sense to plant different types of species under the arrays versus in the full sun area. We haven't seen people do that yet, but I think that's coming as well. Now, we have another question here about validation. Have you run this calculator against a bunch of different sites? The main validation was done at our 5 sites, but we did work with one engineering firm to evaluate our tool versus their engineering firm tool. And we had 90% less runoff than they were generating. And they knew that their runoff calculations were really off. They admitted that. So we do have that one site, and we have talked to other engineering firms who are interested in sharing data with us, but nothing has materialized yet. Any additional feedback from the 150 downloads? Yeah, we're getting a lot of feedback. People say they like it. It's easy to use. It answers a lot of their questions. The main issue is that they just don't know if the local authorities having jurisdiction are going to accept this tool as a way of satisfying the permitting information. So that's kind of the big issue they face.
I can provide some direct feedback. So I work for a solar developer.
All right.
And I work for the engineering side of it before that. And this tool is great. We haven't been able to use the tool because it's the same things, but we are working to implement, kind of back calculate all these on all of our sites and then kind of compare it to what we have. So we have data to go moving forward. But what's been actually really helpful is the results you found on what some of the impacts have been. And we have written, reducing bulk density, limiting site traffic, retilling soils into our erosion control and stormwater specs for our contractors to adhere by.
And who are you? Who is you?
Oh, Pine Gate Renewables.
Oh, Pine Gate Renewables. All right. Well, I mean, wow. I mean, our Oregon site was a Pine Gate Renewables site.
Mm-hmm.
So we have worked with Pine Gate experimentally.
Yeah.
It's one of the more innovative solar companies, yeah. Another question, 70% runoff versus 1% runoff between 100-year and 2-year storms. Is this just due to soil saturation? Yeah, basically that's what it comes down to. If your soil has the infiltration capacity to handle the intensity of rainfall, no runoff will be generated. Whereas if you have a very intense storm and your soil doesn't have the ability to infiltrate that water, anything in excess of the saturated hydraulic conductivity will run off. Well, this has been a fun session today. Thanks so much for all your interest and your questions.
Thanks. Oh, Jay's typing, thanks.
Oh, yeah. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you. We'll see most of you next week.